Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the time lapse for my drawing The Prophet. First of all, thank you very much for taking the time to go through this guide, to listen to what I have to say. I appreciate your time and energy. As you can see in the video so far, I've just been preparing my page, getting the grid method down and ready. I've taped the page to my cutting board. I've made my center lines. I've done some calculations and added in my little blocks. I've numbered them. And we're just going to get right into the sketching process. So as you can see now right here, as I explained in the guide, I first of all just create the outline of the whole piece so I can see where it's all going to fit in. I can early on start to visualize how big the piece is going to look on the page and where it's going to all fit in. Next, I've gone into just sculpting out the bigger shapes and sort of blocking off an area so that I can go in and add in the smaller shapes and then move on to the next section and do the same. Right now I'm just looking for all of the most definite lines, most definite shading, the pieces where it's easy to see the line work and easy to figure out the shapes. And as you can see, just from a couple lines, I've already sculpted out his face and where everything's going to fit into. And then now on the eye, I'm moving in and doing all the smaller details, the smaller shapes that make up those smaller details. Obviously, once we get into the shading and things, I'll get more into the really intricate lines and shapes, but for now I'm just focusing on blocking out the areas that I want to work on. Obviously, going through this time lapse, it's all going to be done much quicker, but in real time, this does and can take quite a long while. I think I spent at least 5 hours just getting this sketch down. So don't be afraid to sit and try and get it right, and don't be afraid if you don't get it right. You can always just erase it and try again. As you can see, we've moved on to the shading here, and the angle does get a little bit better. The color or the lighting does get a little bit better. I was drawing this flat down on my desk, but lately I've just been preferring drawing vertically, so I move on to a vertical surface. I clip my board. I clip my board to a backdrop and then I work upright. It just helps for posture and the lighting to not reflect on the drawing. But as you can see here, I'm busy putting down the first layers, and I work in a little section and then move on, and then work in a little section and then move on. And I line it out in the course of how I start with an HB, just to get the flat shade across the piece so I can easily see where I'm working and then pay attention to that area before I move on. Next, I'd go on to a 2B. You'll see it here now. There's my HB, putting it down, just scribble in this little area, and then I think this is still with a HB. I can't really, yeah, this is still an HB. And then I go in with a little bit of darker shades, a little bit of darker lines. I try and find those spots where it stands out, and these little spots help me visualize the distance between the shapes and the proportions. I don't use a blending stump often. I was just testing it out there to see how it would affect the shading on this paper and on this drawing, because for some reason every drawing, no matter if it's the same paper or not, it gives a different vibe, it gives a different feel. So I just wanted to see what the blending stump would look like. But again, as you might notice, I put down my HB or my B pencil as the first layer. Then I'll go over it with a paintbrush, a soft brush, just to balance out the shading a little bit. Then I'll go in with a darker pencil or create darker shapes to start getting the proportions right. As you can see, this is a little bit of real time just to see how slow and how I actually take my time doing these things. I'm not rushing through. It's a very long process. I think just these couple leaves have already taken me a few hours to do. Now just spend some time just creating a darker shape and then balancing it out, and then creating darker shapes and balancing it out. And once I've got a few layers of my base layers, of my darker shades, of the proportions and things, then I'll go in with a kneaded eraser or some sort of highlighting tool and bring out the highlights, and then I'll balance that out again and continue to just layer on and layer on and layer on. You can see once I've got most of those layers down and the highlights, or at least the highlighted areas, I'll go in with quite a dark pencil and then mark out the little cracks and the really deep dark areas of the shading. I'm just taking some time to add in some more outlines and things and try and see where is the next area that I'm going to work on, or how I can go about the next area. Obviously, with these little sections and things that we work in, the order of the layering and the order of the highlighting and which pencils you're going to use, it changes from each little section to the next, and it changes from each drawing to the next. It's the more practice you put in, the more intuitive this all becomes. I rarely think about what pencil I'm going to go in with. I more just pick up the next pencil and start laying down the shading. But right now, as you can see on the whole piece, I'm working from the top left down to the bottom right, just so I'm making sure that I'm never going over an area and then leaning on it with my hand or smudging the shading away that way. Here on the bottom left of the piece, it's very dark behind his beard and under his chin and his ear, sort of the back of his head. The light is coming from the top, and so his neck and his chin and the back of his head are in some very dark shading. And I've gone in with the 14B and put in the black areas first without even putting down a first layer. Just to, when you put down pencil and then work with the 14B on top or a really dark shade on top, it makes it less saturated for some reason. And so if I'm doing a pitch black area, I like to go in just with a 14B straight away and just make it pitch black. And then the base layer that I put down for this area was not an HB. An HB was a little bit too light. I think I went in straight with a 2B actually, and then just kept on building on the layers on top of that. I think I'm drawing in here with a 4 or 5B now to get those ready, a 14B right there actually. But a trick I like to do is once I've put down all these really dark layers, it'll be difficult to see the pencil that I'm using because obviously it's a time lapse, but I will go in on top of the really dark layers with a hard light pencil like an H or a 2H. And when you scribble in or shade in with those lighter pencils on top of the dark shades, it really starts to, I don't want to say flatten the shading because that's the wrong way to put it, but it really solidifies those areas and it makes it a lot more rich. It's difficult to explain unless you see it happening, but it doesn't really make sense. You think like, okay, if I'm going to go in with a light pencil on top of a dark area, like it shouldn't really do anything, you know what I mean? But for some reason it just actually makes it a lot darker and a lot more saturated. Again here, going in with a fairly dark pencil, I think I went in with a 2B as the base layer and then used a brush to flatten that a little bit, get some of the grayness out of there. I don't completely finish this area just yet because it's getting a little too close to where I would lean my hand if I had to work on the ear or the face. So I just put down a couple of base layers here just to get my brain to understand that this is a darker area and the rest of the piece must be a bit lighter than this. For these dark areas, it can be a little bit difficult to get the layering correct, and once you start adding too many layers, especially of the normal graphite, it can become very thick and almost lacquer, I think that's the word, where it's like it's shiny and waxy almost, and it becomes difficult to add more graphite on top of that. So that's just something to keep in mind. If that does happen, the kneaded eraser is your friend. It will pick up the top layers of graphite quite easily. And yeah, as you can see, I didn't finish off that section there. I just got in the base layers and wanted to move back to the top headpiece and get some lighter, or some of the lighter areas done. But you'll notice the general pattern. As I said, it's different for each little area and each little section, but the general pattern of how I do the layering is a base layer and then either a 2B or a B on top of that, and then I'll brush it in, and then I'll add in some more darker shapes. So I'll start with the mid-tone and work darker and darker until I get to the darkest point, I'd say, and then I go in with a highlight. I bring out those little highlighted areas and then work my way from the lightest to the darkest again. One thing I like to do as well is, if I'm working on a specific area, I never really finish that area on the first pass or the first attempt at it, let's say. You might see me jump back to areas where it looks complete already and add some more details in there, or darken the whole area or lighten the whole area. And that's because the further you go along with the piece and the further you start to understand how dark or light the entire piece is supposed to be, it becomes easier to see where you may have missed details or missed certain values. So don't be afraid or annoyed if you don't get the shading right on the first pass. I think just by this point in already on the piece, I must be somewhere around 5 hours, 6 hours of drawing on this piece. I think I've spent maybe 2 or 3 days on it already. I know that this top piece that I'm shading right now, I think this area alone took about 3 hours. Some of the recording, for some reason, I streamed some of the process, and I time-lapsed some of it, and then I recorded some of it in real time just to see how it would all fit together and affect the full recording. I opted for going a full time-lapse route just because if I included real-time drawing of this, it would be hours and hours of footage. And so if you would like to see real-time drawing, I do stream my drawings on Twitch from time to time. I'm trying to become more consistent with that, but I will be streaming more consistently for my Patreon subscribers as well. And I'll be able to explain my process in real time. So if that's something that interests you, definitely check it out. But some of the detailed areas get cut out in this video. That was not intentional. I just could not find the recording, or I possibly forgot to even press record when I was doing it. But yeah, I got in most of it, and I think you can get the gist of how this process works. So for areas like this is for me where it becomes quite difficult, and it's areas like the cheeks or the forehead, for example, areas that are flat and don't have a lot of definition to them, let's say, where you kind of have to just match up the proportions just with time and effort. There's no really sharp areas to mark off, let's say, like the nostril there. The nostril makes it really easy to notice where things are supposed to go, like how the proportions are supposed to fit around the nostril. So you just have to take your time and build up the shapes and the shapes. As you can see here, I'm literally just working on small shapes and then trying to carve out dark pieces, and then building up another shape and then carving out a dark piece. And this is just so like I can lay down a shape and notice where the proportions fit in, and then mark off a dark area to say like, okay, this is where this dark area goes, or this is where this harsh line goes. The quality dipped on this area a little bit, and as you can see in the bottom left of the screen, this was a stream that I did on Twitch, and so that is the comment section. I did my best to cut it out, but hopefully that doesn't bother you too much. This beard area took me a very long time, I will admit. It is difficult to get beards and hair, especially when it's in a stone texture, because there's just a lot of lines, a lot of flowing lines, a lot of cracks and like intricate areas and things, and so you really just, there's no secret to doing these sort of areas. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of erasing mistakes, and it's obviously difficult to see on the time lapse, but there was a lot of times I was making mistakes on this piece or couldn't figure out where I was on the piece, or just had to erase certain areas and take a long time to build up these values and build up these details. It did not just come on one try, and it never really does come on one try. As I said, it's a lot of bouncing back and forth, and once you add in the details or the proportions of one area, it can knock off the proportions of another, and you have to sort of constantly go back and forth and balance these areas. Now, one thing that you see that I did here is I put down a base layer of shading, and then I went with the 14B on top of that. And I know I said earlier that that's not something that I like to do, but here the areas were really dark, but they weren't quite black. Another thing that made it like slightly more of an exception is I put down the base layer of shading, but I didn't blend it. And when you blend it, it sort of pushes the graphite around to make it really smooth and really even, and that becomes difficult to draw on top of sometimes. If you blend it in too much, the page becomes too smooth, and it's almost like your pencils don't have enough texture to grate the pencil away onto the paper. Because if you think about it, if your page is more textured, your pencil will scrape onto the paper easier, if that makes sense, if I can describe it like that. And so more pencil will come off onto the paper, but when you blend it smooth, it doesn't work the same. The one thing that helped me through this beard section, as you can see here, I've sort of done a couple layers over the whole beard, just so I understand where each part of the beard is, because it's obviously not individual hairs, but it is chunks of the beard that are carved out. And so I put down a few layers so I understood where each section of the beard was, and then I went on each individual section and completed that section, moved on to the next one, completed that section, moved on to the next one. And constantly as I was going, I was having to fix up little proportions here or fix up values over here, and just I had to go back and forth just balancing these areas out. In terms of details, if you look at the tiny little black spots that I've made, they all have really small highlights there. It's a bit easier to see now. But when you're adding details, especially in stone, these little cracks will always have a little highlight next to them, and they'll always be on like sort of the edges of the beard or like sharper points. They rarely come into play if it's like a flat section or something that doesn't have any sharp edges. And obviously because it's a stone texture, it's going to break on the sharper areas, the pieces that stick out a little bit. There isn't much of a secret when it comes to adding the details, and there isn't really a right or wrong way of doing it either. If you see me do this in real time, you'll notice that a lot of these pencil strokes are quite random, and there's a lot of circular scribbling, and I intentionally don't blend in some of the shading, and I do blend in other parts of it just to add variation and mix up the textures, and so it becomes a lot more convincing to your brain. But that is pretty much it for the entire drawing. Here I just go over the outline of the piece with the charcoal pencil to add the black background. And obviously I first go around the piece just to add that outline so I don't accidentally scribble onto the drawing. Then I can see exactly where I'm working. Again, there's no secret to doing the charcoal outline or putting down the charcoal, but you do have to press quite hard and take it quite slow. Obviously it's a time lapse, so it's sped up, but when you're drawing the actual charcoal, take your time with it. Make sure that it really fills in those little white specks, because they are quite easy to notice once the piece is fully blacked out. Those little white specks sort of capture the attention really easily, and so you want to make sure those are thoroughly drawn over. And then I go over the charcoal drawing with my fingers, because the oil on your skin does nice to blend in the charcoal into those little gaps in the paper, and it takes away the directional scrapes. But that is pretty much it for the drawing time lapse. I do hope you enjoyed. It's a little bit difficult to explain the exact processes I'm going through on a time lapse, so I hope that this helped. But anyways, if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. You can check me out on Instagram and sign up to my newsletter. The links will be in the description. Have a lovely day. Stay hydrated and keep practicing.